First of all, welcome to the third seminar in our series of uh, seminars on the history of official history, and this time is devoted to the history of nuclear power in Britain. And before I introduce the speaker, just a few of the usual sort of housekeeping points. Remember that this is going to be recorded, so everything everybody says will be publicly available. And actually, the first two sessions are already available online. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. If you want to raise points at any point, just raise your hand and that you can obviously contribute in the discussion. And perhaps I can put in a plug now for the next one, which is in 3 weeks' time, and that's on the 20th of March. And we return to the history of intelligence with Jill Bennett and Declan O'Reilly. So that's a look forward. Tonight, it's an enormous pleasure to introduce three speakers rather than the two who are advertised. The first will be Matthew Jones, a professor at LSE, but actually currently in New York as we speak. And he's the author of the 2-volume official history of the British strategic nuclear deterrent, published in 2017. We have another official historian, and that's Michael Goodman, who will be commenting on the first two papers. He's the historian of the Joint Intelligence Committee, but also has knowledge of the history of atomic power in Britain. And then very much, perhaps I could say a very non-official historian, Sue Roff, who specialises really in the history of nuclear testing in Australia. In one way or other, I suppose we'll all be reflecting on one person, and that's Margaret Gowing, who was the author of the pioneering history of British atomic energy in the Second World War, published in 1964, which has a wider relevance also because it was the model for the peacetime series of official histories, which was started in the 1960s and still continues in some form, at least. Matthew will speak first, Sue will go next, and then Michael will take over finally. So Matthew, can I invite you to start?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Patrick. And I have a few slides, just picture slides to show. So everyone see the slide that's up there now? Yeah, good. And as Patrick said, what I want to talk to you about today is this book published in 1964 by Margaret Gowing, Britain and Atomic Energy, 1939 to 1945. And in the time I have, I want to cover the reasons why the history was commissioned, Gowing's remit, and the issues of censorship and publication when officials first looked at the text in 1963. And then also to make the point in the postscript really to this talk that Gowing's book shows that apart from its intrinsic value as a work of history, it was a pioneering and important work in many other ways as well. And as Patrick said, in instigating the Cabinet Office Official History Programme in many respects, and also in paving the way for the introduction of the famous 30-year rule for the handling of public records. So the best way to begin the story really is with Gowing's appointment to the UK Atomic Energy Authority. In December 1958, a job advert appeared for the combined post of archivist and historian to work at the London headquarters of the Atomic Energy Authority. The passage of the Public Records Act of 1958 had put the proper keeping of departmental records on a statutory footing and provided for their potential release after 50 years. And the AEA had agreed that its files should be treated as public records under the new Act, and it would have need of a departmental records officer as a result. But it also decided that in view of the historical importance of the wartime atomic energy project and the decision to preserve records of interest to the historian, that the combined post of archivist and historian should be created with a view to the writing of a history. Now, after 14 years of work with Sir Keith Hancock and his Wartime Official Histories series on the civil side of the Cabinet Office, Gowing was appointed in June 1959 and quickly set about establishing the principles for the destruction or retention of AEA records. But by the following year, 1960, she and the authority were ready to move forward with the writing of the history. And it's quite clear that Gowing helped to write her own brief for the job she was to undertake. Different models for a history were considered and rejected by officials. These included a technical study for scientists, which Gowing was not equipped to write, a confidential internal history, or a short and popular account. It was, however, decided to begin a 2-volume project, which would offer what was called a synoptic account, from originally 1940 to the creation of the AEA in August 1954. It was to be a, quote, serious, unquote, historical work aimed at the intelligent layman, covering the development of policy, analysing important factors and the consequences of decisions taken. But as one official put it, serious in this context is not, of course, meant to be boring, but it does imply a history written according to strict critical standards. It would be prefixed by a rubric to the effect that while the author had been given free access to official documents, she alone was responsible for the statements made and views expressed. And of course, this became the form of words, with changes of gender, used thereafter in the government's later official history series, and was an indicator that the historian would be free to offer their own judgments, interpretations, and conclusions on the material they were using. But questions of a political nature, the AEA initially felt, should not be discussed by Gowing in any published work. Examples given were the reasons why Britain decided to develop atomic weapons in the first place, subjects such as international control of atomic energy and the conduct of tests. Though this injunction about any political aspect to the interpretations would not, of course, prove to be practical in the end. While the AEA would not be restrictive in how history was assembled, it would also retain control over the final decision of whether or not to publish. A small advisory committee of professional historians would be formed to provide some oversight for the project and to give some added confidence to the historical profession that its standards were rigorous. The Cabinet Secretary's approval for publication would have to be sought, it was decided, as the history could not be written from AEA records alone, but would need access to the records of the Cabinet and its committees. AEA officials also needed to consider what they called the status of Mrs. Gowing, particularly, of course, as she was an AEA employee. And this is something she considered especially important. One official said, quote, she puts the point, which I'm sure is well-founded, that the weight which a publication will carry in informal circles, particularly among professional historians, is directly proportional to the freedom accorded to the writer, i.e. something in which he or she has a completely free hand will be seriously regarded, something in which no more than an official handout will be disregarded. The chairman of the AEA, Sir Roger Makins, to whom Gowing directly reported, later said it was important, quote, to demonstrate the finished text is not a whitewashing operation. He also told Gowing he wanted to see, quote, an objective historical work and not an official eulogy. Yet this freedom had to be balanced against the wishes of the Cabinet Office to assert the right to suggest amendments or alterations. Within the Cabinet Office, Norman Brooke, the Cabinet Secretary, had managed to ascertain there was no precedent for the current enterprise of a department taking the initiative in devising and writing such a history. One of his officials wrote that he imagined that on the technical side, the security objections to atomic energy volume had largely disappeared, but, quote, the political aspect may well be another matter. But the consensus was that as long as the AEA reserved the right to consider amendments or to deny permission to publish, it was a worthwhile venture and, quote, might well point valuable lessons for the future, unquote. Gowing began all-out work on her volume in 1961, backed up by the advisory committee of 3 historians. One Cabinet Office official needlessly minuting, quote, one must hope that Mrs. Gowing will not find it a little overpowering, unquote. At every stage, Gowing was given support and encouragement by Makins, who was ready to badger at reluctant officials to open their files to her. By the early summer of 1963, a first draft of the book was complete. Just over 2 years, in other words, of research and writing, a remarkably short space of time, I think. And Makins sent the text to Bert Trend, who by then, of 1963, was the new Cabinet Secretary, having succeeded Brooke. Makins rested his case for publication on the recent appearance in 1962 of the US Atomic Energy Commission official history of the New World, and also the appearance of the memoirs of Leslie Groves, the head of the wartime Manhattan Project. The military historian Michael Howard had also written a review of the Groves book in the Sunday Times, where he made the point the British side of events was in danger of going by default if the rumoured and mooted AEA history was not published. It was also important, Howard said, that the British history should be no less frank and open than the American. Trend and Cabinet Office officials did, however, have problems with some areas of the text. An important part of Gowing's narrative was her account of the unfortunate encounter between renowned Danish physicist Niels Bohr and Churchill in May 1944. Deeply concerned about the post-war prospects for a nuclear arms race and the urgent need to establish international controls over atomic energy, Bohr, backed by senior officials such as Sir John Anderson, had engineered a meeting with Churchill in May 1944, where he had argued that the Russians should be informed that work on an atomic bomb was underway. An impatient and annoyed Prime Minister had dismissed Bohr out of hand, even asking later whether Bohr might represent a security risk. Now, it was well known that Bohr had tried a similar approach to Roosevelt in August 1944, and the US authors of the AEC history had written this into their volume. But the earlier meeting with Churchill was new to the public and so represented a Gowing scoop. The Cabinet Office soon raised objections to the draft that Gowing chose to present. In a convention that arose in the early 50s, the Cabinet Secretary had taken it upon himself to ensure what were called, quote, Sir Winston Churchill's interests were taken into account in the publication and production of the wartime series of official histories. One official wondered if publication could lead to the possibility of criticism of Churchill, quote, as the man chiefly responsible for the loss of an opportunity to prevent a post-war atomic arms race, unquote. There was even concern that because of the outcome of his May 44 meeting with Bohr, Churchill would appear to be the principal author of the controversial third clause of the Hyde Park Agreement of September 1944. This was an episode where Churchill had met Roosevelt at his Hyde Park home, and the two had agreed an aide-memoire which stressed post-war collaboration over atomic energy and rejected informing the Russians of ongoing work on the bomb project. The third clause of the document mentioned that Bohr should be investigated as a potential security risk. And this is what the third clause says. It said inquiries should be made regarding the activities of Professor Bohr and steps taken to ensure that he is responsible for no leakage of information, particularly to the Russians. Now, this clause, the third clause, had not been reproduced in the AEC, American official history, and it was thought it was not published by the Americans because it contained an implied doubt over the security reliability of the famous scientist. Gowing, however, wanted to print the communique in full for the first time. Now, in July 1963, Trend wrote to Sir Anthony Montagu Brown, Churchill's private secretary, and for those who know the story, Justin Welby's father, to warn him that publication of the text as it stood could provoke critical reflections on Churchill's, quote, judgment of an outstanding personality. After he consulted Churchill, however, Montagu Brown replied there was a need for Gowing's text to provide more context on relations with the Soviet Union in 1944 so that readers could understand his doubts. Gowing acceded to this wish, but Trend went even further, suggesting that Gowing remove her summing up of the affair as he felt it overpraised the scientist. Now, once more, Gowing removed her own comments about the Bohr incident from the end of the account, but Makins now stepped in to say he hoped the rest of the text could now stand. Makins said, it would be contrary to the intention and purpose of this history to produce a restrained document which would inevitably smack of censorship, he told Trend, and wrong to leave the field to the full and frank US history that had just appeared. Gowing did insist that the third clause of the Hyde Park Agreement be published, while a coverage of the episode made it quite clear that Bohr was not a security risk, in fact, far from it. It is also important to note here that Gowing had travelled to Copenhagen twice in early 1962 to interview Bohr and had built up a relationship with his family. She called her encounter with Bohr, lasting 4 hours, quote, the most wonderful talk in the world. In fact, if there's any hero of the book, it's actually Niels Bohr. She also gave Bohr the first drafts of her account of the meeting with Churchill to read and told Bohr what was in the third clause of the Hyde Park Agreement in a letter of the 1st of February 1962. Now, Bohr had died in November 1962, but he evidently had no objection to Gowing's story of his meeting with Churchill being recorded for the benefit of history, while to the Bohr family, the omission of the clause could seem like suppression of an essential truth to his story, as they put it. All points which Gowing used to stick to her original draft. When the Foreign Office received copies of Gowing's draft in July 1963, they were relaxed about its contents, despite the passages where she had made clear that Churchill in early 1945 had rejected the idea of a close collaboration with France in the nuclear field. However, Trend was not so sure about this. The Partial Test Ban Treaty had only recently been signed in Moscow. This was the summer of 1963, remember, and Kennedy and Macmillan were undertaking a close dialogue about how France might be persuaded to join the treaty regime, perhaps with a transfer of nuclear information. The Cabinet Secretary wondered if Gowing's book might provide ammunition to de Gaulle, demonstrating British perfidy back in 1945. But Makins and Gowing thought this was an overreaction. At the end of September 1963, the Lord Privy Seal, Edward Heath, wrote to Macmillan, drawing the Prime Minister's attention to the foreign policy aspects of Gowing's book. The main worry was that it seemed to imply that in early 1945, de Gaulle might turn to the Soviet Union for assistance if Britain rejected Anglo-French nuclear collaboration. Macmillan was said to be, quote, not too happy with all this and wanted to discuss publication with his Foreign Secretary, Lord Hume, after October's Conservative Party conference in Blackpool. However, Macmillan's enforced retirement through ill health just before the conference meant it would be the new Prime Minister, Alec Douglas Hume, the former Foreign Secretary, who would receive a minute from Trend at the end of October explaining plans for the publication of Gowing's history. By now, Makins felt it was, quote, impossible to believe that the book could have any adverse effect on Anglo-French relations, unquote. In fact, Makins was becoming alarmed by the signs of delay, asking Trend, can we not assume that Sir Alec Douglas Hume, as Prime Minister, will agree with Lord Hume as Foreign Secretary, as the Foreign Office had previously been happy to see the book go ahead? But in November 1963, Douglas Hume indicated that while he approved publication, he favoured postponement until the end of 1964. Timing was now becoming an overtly political matter, as Downing Street officials were already beginning to think about the election that would have to occur by October 1964. They did not relish the prospect of a book appearing under official auspices which might arouse controversy over nuclear matters, especially when the issue of Britain's nuclear independence or otherwise had become a major bone of political contention between the Conservatives and Labour in the wake of the Nassau Agreement. Various pretexts for delay were mooted, and it's quite amusing to read what they were, but eventually it was decided to ask Macmillan's, the publisher, to, quote, create an artificial delay in publication through an approach to the person who was called their most illustrious director. In other words, Macmillan, who is now retired, of course, and the former Prime Minister, will be asked if he could manage to ask the firm of Macmillan's to delay the publication. Now, in the event, Britain and Atomic Energy was actually published on the 24th of September, 1964, a good 3 weeks before the general election. Bemused Cabinet Office officials wondered what could have gone awry with the scheme they had concocted at the end of the previous year. In fact, Trend had had to tell Douglas Hume on the 17th of September that his instructions to the publisher, relayed by Macmillan, had been disregarded, and he was not sure why. When informed, Macmillan had simply said it was now too late. Review copies had already been distributed, and the BBC was about to feature the book that evening on one of its programmes. As one Cabinet Office official put it, the horse had bolted. Britain and Atomic Energy did not cause any of the stirs which had been feared in some corners of Whitehall. Trend himself thought Gowing's book an admirable production, scholarly and scrupulously fair, and reviews by many historians were glowingly positive. Now, there is a postscript to this story, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk.
Yes. Are you going to be here tomorrow or no?
With some obvious reluctance, officials then began to contemplate Gowing's bid to start work on a successive volume covering the early post-war years, because there had been mention of 2 volumes when the commission was originally made. On the 15th of October 1964, the day after the general election, Lord Penny, who had taken Makin's place at the head of the AEA, met Trend to discuss the second volume issue. Trend was clearly worried by the difference in principle between wartime and a peacetime post-war study. Penny agreed, but thought that the main case for a volume 2 would rest on the need to have a British volume to counterbalance the US history, which they knew was ongoing in the post-war years by the Atomic Energy Commission. Although on balance supportive, not least as Gowing's first volume had attracted universal praise, Trend realised that letting her loose on post-war papers and the documents of other departments created a new precedent. There were already calls from the historical profession and the interested public to reduce the closure period on public records of 50 years set out by the 1958 legislation. If Gowing was given privileged access, such calls could increase and become difficult to resist. It would also mean official history stepping into the post-war period and peacetime events when hitherto there had only been official war histories, or in Gowing's case, events during the national crisis of war. A post-war volume therefore raised the issue of whether the government should embark upon a new series of histories dealing with aspects of government policy after 1945. Trend put all these issues to the new Labour Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, in January 1965. Trend's own position was supportive, calling the UK's post-war atomic energy contribution, quote, largely unknown and ignored, unquote, once more mentioning that the US Atomic Energy Commission history made it desirable to have a comparable British volume, although it should not be merely as a matter of national interest or prestige, but the sake of historical completeness and accuracy, as Trend put it. There was, he reminded the Prime Minister, the danger of the British case going by default. The problem was a post-war volume would delve into such sensitive matters as a tightly restricted handling of atomic energy by Attlee and a few senior ministers, and for that reason, the government will still need to reserve final decision over publication. The Cabinet Secretary also used the opportunity to propose a scheme for a series of officially sponsored histories of peacetime events, with the Gowing volume as, in effect, a pilot. Now, Wilson decided to authorize the successor volume, and on the 1st of March 1965, Trend finally wrote to Penny to tell him that the formal go-ahead had been given by ministers to a volume 2, with Gowing accorded access to, quote, to all relevant documents. Now, already, however, Gowing was back in number 10, the archives there, working on the post-war papers. In 1966, following Trend's initiative, the Cabinet Office duly established an official history program to cover peacetime events. But the pressure for a Gowing successor volume coming from the author and the AEA also had the effect of forcing the issue of reform of the 50-year rule. And a campaign had been mounting for some time, as I said before, for the release of wartime documents. In March 1967, Wilson was to announce to the House of Commons the closed period for public records would be reduced to 30 years, so establishing the famous 30-year rule, a reform which was to open up a whole new sway of Second World War and Cold War history to researchers in the 1970s and 1980s. And of course, 1974 finally saw the publication by Margaret Gowing, this time with the help of Lorna Arnold, of the successor volume, Independence and Deterrence, which took the British nuclear story up to 1952. And there I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matthew. There's all sorts of things we can pick up on there. I like the way in which official efforts are thwarted by the publishers, for instance, but also the way in which you linked it to both the peacetime series, but also the introduction of the 30-year rule, which people like me, I now realise, benefited from in the 1970s and 1980s. I think we'll move straight on to Sue, if that's okay. And you can see Sue's presentation coming up on the screen now. Please take over, Sue. And use your unmute yourself first. That's it.
Yeah. Thank you. And I apologise for my halo effect, but that's how we do it here in Scotland. Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all and to hear the genesis of the official histories. But what I'm looking at is the Lorna Arnold period primarily. And Matthew just mentioned that she had become an assistant to Margaret Gowing for the second volume, and she had in effect served a sort of apprenticeship with Margaret Gowing. She produced four, next slide if you would, Philip, thanks. She produced these 3 books over 20 years from 1985-86 to 2006. She was born in 1915, so she was well into her middle age by the time that she wrote A Very Special Relationship, and then she didn't stop publishing until she was 97, 98. She had a 4th book that I'll show you in a moment. Next slide, please. So who was publishing these books? First of all, they were written under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Authority. Secondly, they were copyrighted by Her Majesty's Stationery Office or the Ministry of Defence. They were published by Palgrave Macmillan, who was, as Matthew has mentioned, the family company of the former Prime Minister Macmillan. So they have what I consider to be quite a sound pedigree in terms of official history definition. And it was important to notice that the first publication, The History of the Australian Tests, was written for submission to the Royal Commission into British nuclear tests in Australia in 1985-1986. And it was vetted by the Cabinet Office in order to go forward to the Royal Commission. The councillors for the Royal Commission for the British government were very apprehensive about what Mrs. Arnold might produce. Next slide, please. Mrs. Arnold, Lorna Arnold, had been an administrative secretariat person in government offices, including in Washington and other places during the war years. And she had a very strong history in the secretariat side of activities. She was recruited into the AEA in her 50s, and as the 30-year rule was impending and Margaret Gowing was needing more support, she had never had any historical training or any scientific training. And I think this is important if we realize the significance of the material that she was producing as being the official government version of what had happened in Australia over the 12 years of the testing. And then in the Pacific Islands of Christmas Island and Malden in the grapple period. It's interesting to note that, as Matthew has mentioned, Roger Makins, who was himself a highly trained historian, had been chair of AEA, followed by William Penny, who was a scientific director for most of these weapons tests. And yet the person that they appointed for writing these histories was not particularly well trained in historical exercises. If we could have the next slide, please. This is a picture of Lorna Arnold. This is her 2012 book. When she was nearly 100 years old, she wrote a very interesting autobiography in which she reflects on her function in that post with the AEA writing those books. Next slide, please. She wrote, as you can see there, and it'll be available if the material is put online by Patrick and his colleagues, and I'll put it on my website. But she considered herself to have had two great advantages precisely because she was embedded in the organization that she was writing about. And she felt that she had a considerable amount of input and free access to Sir William Penny and other people along the way, in which she could check her material. And she did not seem to think that this was a disadvantage in terms of objectivity or externality to the material that she was working on. Next slide, please. She produced these books with the assistance in the second last book, Britain and the H-bomb, of a former engineering specialist in nuclear industry, a lady called Catherine Pine. And this was the first advent of a technical historian, somebody with actually a scientific training and practice behind her, into the historical section of the AEA. And Miss Pine had gone back to university in her 40s or 50s, and she was writing a dissertation and doing an undergraduate degree at Queen Mary Westfield College at the University of London. And she wrote a very interesting article, which is available online, which was published in 1995. So this was her third year undergraduate paper, and it will tell you a lot more than you might find in Lorna Arnold's work about what was actually going on in the development of the British hydrogen bomb, 1954 to 58. Miss Pine continued with her work, and she was supervised for her PhD under Professor Michael Goodman, who I will hear from in a few minutes. And she wrote not about the Australian tests in particular, but the more general picture of the history of thermonuclear warhead principles in the UK, which is, I think, a way of saying a history of science to establish what people thought, what they knew, what they were able to develop in the move from the atomic level of weapons production to the hydrogen or thermonuclear stage of weapons production, which is generally thought to have been achieved in Britain in the Grapple series of tests in the period 57-58 outside of Australia. The history of thermonuclear warhead principles, her thesis is classified, as I understand it, and one cannot gain a copy of it in order to understand what she was thinking, what she was demonstrating. But that earlier article gives you some indication of where her thoughts were. And it was an important contrast for what Lorna Arnold was writing. If we could have the next slide, please. Because Lorna Arnold, in a period from 1987 to 2006, found it very, very difficult to accept that what was actually going on in Australia, leading to the Grapple series, was the development of various forms of thermonuclear weaponry as distinct from atomic weaponry. And I won't bore you with the details of the differences, but there's certainly a massive uptake, a massive upleap in capacity in a hydrogen bomb over an atomic bomb. And the British government repeatedly said, and I outline this in my material that I have online called Making the British H-Bomb in Australia, the British government repeatedly promised publicly that it would not go thermonuclear in Australia. And Lorna Arnold, amongst other people, believed this, even though there's considerable archival evidence, which I outline tedious point by tedious point, that the correspondence, the dialogue between British politicians and scientists from Prime Minister down to Prime Minister Menzies and his government on down clearly indicate that they did move to thermonuclear field testing in Australia, that Prime Minister Menzies knew about it, and that, albeit reluctantly, he accepted it. And I argue in one of my papers that this was because he thought he had been promised at least strategic nuclear weapons if and when Britain couldn't stay east of Suez anymore. The move from atomic to fusion thermonuclear started after the first detonation, which was Hurricane, which was purely atomic, I think, in the Montebellos. But immediately after that at Emu, and then particularly at the Montebellos again, and then culminating in the Buffalo tests in Maralinga a few weeks before the opening of the 1956 Olympic Games, downwind of all these sites, they were a series of parallel tests that were both atomic and early thermonuclear hydrogen and hybrid ones of both these capacities. Not least because it was accepted by this stage that the atomic bomb was to be the trigger for the hydrogen bomb. And there needed to be quite a lot of testing to get that triggering mechanism right. Again, I put out all my evidence in my online publications. It was, I think, this work, this progress, this hybrid parallel development of atomic and hydrogen weaponry by way of field testing, component testing in the Mosaic and Buffalo series in Australia, I think Catherine Pine understood this. And she co-wrote the 2001 book with Lorna Arnold on Britain and the H-bomb. But still there, you find very interesting statements that seem to be written by Arnold, where she's stating clearly she could not believe that the British government had gone thermonuclear in Australia. However, 5 years later, Lorna Arnold accepted that proposition because she said the release of official documents since 1987, which is a good 20 years earlier, has enabled us to explain better the interrelationship of certain Australian and Christmas Island tests and present an outline of the 1952-58 British tests as a coherent program. And I point to the evidence that forced her to accept that. Next slide, please. Now, in the previous slide, you will notice that she said release of important documents since 1987, in effect, has forced us to accept this. But there was a publication in 1986 by John Walker. It was his PhD thesis done at the University of Edinburgh, available online, I hope he realizes, which demonstrates that in 1986, at least one researcher was able to see what was going on that the official histories were not inquiring into. And he points us to one section of the Royal Commission transcripts, which run to well over 10,000 pages, of which I would say about 1,000 have been reasonably read by researchers. But Vice Admiral Sir Hugh Martel, who was very involved with the Mosaic 1956 detonations, which were very controversial, he was being cross-examined by the Australian council assisting the Royal Commission. And Peter McClellan said, as a preface to his questioning, the Royal Commission is aware at this point that both of the explosions of Mosaic were designed as scientific experiments, which were a step in the development of the hydrogen bomb by the British government. You won't see any reference to that in the report of the Royal Commission into British nuclear testing in Australia. But I think it's important to say that if John Walker could find this material in 1986, one might have hoped that Lorna Arnold would have also read the Royal Commission reports and found her way to it too. If we could have the next slide, please. The consequence of this was that not only did Arnold not understand what was going on in Australia as the move from atomic to hybrid to thermonuclear, which ended up in the grapple shots in Malden and Christmas Island, but she also misread the grapple series. And that is the fully acknowledged thermonuclear stage of British developments. But Arnold says that in her book called Britain and the H-bomb, that the gravel shots were not a bad start, going straight from the drawing board in Britain to an airdropped test device in the Christmas Island series. Well, they didn't. They go straight from the drawing board. They were developed, refined, tested, all but fully, what is the opposite of dismantled? Mantled, all but fully combined into testable weapons, which the British did move away out of Australia because that was a step too far, even for Prime Minister Menzies. And these tests started at Emu Field and continued right through the full series of 11 tests that followed.
Should be finishing now, 20 and 20.
Good. And then I think if we look at the last slide, I am finishing. Yes. Anyway, if you find this all a bit provoking and annoying, I can just say that 10 years of delving in the National Archives and the Australian Archives, I have set out the evidence in this material on my website, which is called Rabbit Review. And my last word of warning is, if you want to look at that website, notice that my name, my family name, has got 2 T's in Rabbit. And if you don't write that right, you will end up in some very odd sites, which I did not realize when I chose that name. Thank you for the opportunity to suggest. I'm suggesting that actually I feel very strongly that we were shortchanged by the histories that we've had, and it's really time, since there's oodles, thousands of pages online in both the archives of Australia and Britain, as well as in the actual depositories, where we should there really should be a task force to wade through all that stuff to see what actually went on, instead of what the histories tell us. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Sue. That's an extraordinary. There's so much in what you've just been talking about that we'll want to pick up later. And I noticed, for instance, John Walker is already here listening in and commenting. So we'll come back to John later. But I was struck first of all by the general point about official history is that, you know, the advantage of being embedded, so-called, also means the risk that you're no longer objective. But secondly, the whole unraveling of what you've described as the deceptions practiced by the British, and I suppose to a lesser extent the Australian government, over the whole question of testing in Australia. Well, Catherine Pine was mentioned by Sue, and I think it's an appropriate point to ask Mike to come in, because as Sue said, you did supervise Catherine. So please, Michael, take over.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, good. I'm sitting in a coffee shop, and I'm sure the other people in here are very keen to hear what I've got to say, so hopefully yeah, I mean, I supervised Kate's thesis, which was probably 10 years ago now, and as Sue mentioned, she unfortunately did pass away before the thesis was finished, and it took a lot of effort to get it examined posthumously via King's, which did not then have a process for it. And the thesis was classified, remains classified, and the great advantage is that I have very little memory of it, which makes it easier to then not talk about it. But it was a thesis, I recall, which we had to get permission from King's to go for, because they said, you know, why do we have a PhD thesis if it's then not available for the public to read? And the argument we made was that actually this is a thesis that needs to be written, and no one else has the expertise, the access to people at that time who was some of them listening live, the understanding of the technical aspects, the what went on. And so actually this was a snapshot in time that had to be done then, even if it wasn't going to be immediately released. It's also taking into account the fact that there were lots of people within the MOD and Aldermas, of course, who could read it. So it was a thesis, it was written, it was examined, it was finished. It wasn't quite as polished as perhaps it would have been, but it was absolutely a thesis in its own right. And it was really designed to pick up, I think, a gap that Lorna Arnold had identified in her H-bomb book, which was, in very simple terms, a period where almost a 4-week window, where at the start of this 4-week period, the scientists in the UK did not know how to make the bomb. And at the end of the 4-week period, William Penny, the head of the programme, sort of came into a classroom, flipped a blackboard over, scribbled something on the board and said, here is how we do it. And Kate's thesis was all about what happened in those 4 weeks. How did we go from not really understanding to and having good understanding of it. And it was sensitive for a variety of reasons, which I don't need to go into, but I think it was a thesis that will add to things. I'll come back to it if I can just for a few minutes to add some comments on what Matt said, and then moving on to what Sue said. I mean, I was struck when Matt began by saying that Gowing's book was published 20 years after the war, and the simple fact of that is, I think, if you stop and reflect for a moment, that 20-year period going from the wartime era where, aside from Enigma, the atomic bomb was the secret, beyond anything else. It was one of probably the two most sensitive aspects. Fast forward 20 years, and here's a book which is being written, sort of declaring warts and all about what happened and what went on. So I think that's quite an interesting process, how information can go from being so sensitive to then being released. I was also quite struck by the level of involvement within government. Successive cabinet secretaries were involved with this. Roger Makins, who'd been a very high-flying diplomat, of course, British ambassador to the US. Even the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary being involved. And I think those highlight in some ways, the value that official histories can have. And I know we're not here to take a step back and reflect on official histories and their demise, but I think it's a sad, reality. I think if we look at how important some of these books were and have been, and where we are today, and perhaps we can come back to that in questions. But it does, I mean, listening to what Matt said about Gowing's contract actually was remarkably similar to my own one for the JIC history, this idea that it's aimed at the intelligence layman, but shouldn't be boring. I remember for my one, David Oman, former GCHQ director, came up to me and said, "It's a serious history," which I think was both a compliment and a criticism. I was also struck by the comments or the criticisms of Hinsley's official histories. It's a book about a committee, written by a committee for a committee, and so I think the fact that Gowing's book was actually so readable is a real testament to her abilities as a historian. Matt's talk left me with three questions really, which I'll pose now, and he can either address them afterwards or come back to them later, whatever. The first one was he sort of hinted at this a little bit, but didn't really address it, which was, what value did it actually have? These official histories are designed for the sort of first telling of history, if you like, someone who has access to everything, putting the first record out there. But what was the value in government? Did it achieve anything? He spoke a little bit about the politics around the release of it, but what significance did it have? Second question, I was quite struck by the fact that the first draft was ready within 2 years, which makes me embarrassed to think that my second volume has taken 10 years and still counting, but there are reasons for that. But the book was, in his words, or the intention was, it should be no less frank than the US books. And I want to know, was it? That was the intention. Did it actually meet that intention? And then the third question was, going back to this first point about, secrecy and how it changed over a short period of time. What was omitted? Was there stuff that she chose at the time to leave out? Was there stuff that was removed through the security process? There's little discussion of intelligence, for instance. The balance that she struck, I think, between talking about the politics of the decision and the science of the devices themselves is quite interesting. And obviously, there are various sensitivities around that. But, what was missing and what might she have liked to have seen? And then just quickly moving on to Sue's talk, which I thought was a little bit unfair on Lorna Arnold. I knew her a bit in her 90s. I also knew Kate much better, and I think the fact that she had no formal historical training doesn't mean that she can't consider herself a historian or perform a very good historical record. And I think her books are very good in different ways. I think if there ever was a criticism of her, it's the fact that she didn't really understand the technical side so much, and that's actually the reason why Kate was then brought on board for the H-bomb book in the mid-90s, to have someone who understood the technology to complement the sort of politics of what was going on in there, I think. And so I think the criticism is a little bit unfair about her. The question I think I have for Sue is, your talk sort of focused on three areas really. One is the politics of this decision to build the H-bomb and to test them in Australia. You spoke a little bit about the scientific elements of this and how that evolved, but also this question of sort of owning up to the reality and managing what went on in Australia itself, and the Commonwealth aspects. And I think the Commonwealth aspects are quite an unexplored area of the programme. I had a very good PhD student a few years ago called Richard Brown, whose thesis I think should be on the British Library website, but he looked at the Commonwealth aspects of Britain's atomic bomb rather than the H bomb itself. And so I just wondered if perhaps Sue could be a bit clearer in terms of how does she strike the balance between the technical aspects, the political aspects, and other things. But I think I'll probably stop there, Patrick, and hand back to you. You're muted, Patrick, by the way.
Thank you very much. What you've got there is a really interesting range of general questions as well as specific ones. But what I think we might do, if I may, is open up the discussion quite quickly to the rest of the audience. And I've now been able to read John Walker's comment here, and I think, John, I very much like it if you could expand on what you wrote there and maybe explain it to the rest of us, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks very much, Patrick, and thanks very much to Matthew and Sue for very interesting accounts. I have to dash in a few minutes, so I'll try and be brief. I knew Lorna and Kate very well and worked with them a lot. And Kate often used to say in those early years, people weren't quite sure what they actually understood by the term H-bomb. There was a lot of uncertainty until some of the more theoretical work was done. And it became quickly clear that Penny had ideas for basically two types of weapon. One was actually going to be an extremely large fission bomb, because the aim was to get 1 megaton in 1 ton. And that was one of the things they were going to test at Christmas Island. And the other one was a more advanced, what would now be regarded as the H-bomb. It's a 2-stage weapon, radiation implosion, where you have a fission trigger, which sets off the secondary, i.e. the thermonuclear stage. And the secret here is to get what's known as the primary, the fission trigger, to work effectively. And what was being investigated in some of the trials in Australia and also the fission shots at Christmas Island was getting a boosted fission weapon where tritium gas was injected into the core at the point of detonation to generate far more neutrons and therefore a much more efficient fission trigger. Now that is not a thermonuclear weapon by any stretch of the imagination, and what was tested in Australia would not be regarded as a thermonuclear weapon, but the comment that they were linked to what was ultimately planned for the Christmas Island, Malden Island tests was that they could not conduct very large tests, expected to be at least a megaton on Australia, and that was very clear at the time. So I think certainly Kate understood that point very clearly, and that comes out clearly in Lorna and Kate's book, Britain and the H-bomb. And there's certainly a lot of the technical papers that have leaked into the National Archives at Kew, which I also looked at when I did my book, British Weapons of the Test Ban. Really make that pretty clear. That was the thing they were grappling with. And if I may, Patrick, just one other comment, which goes back to Matthew's observations, and it also links to my own experience about trying to get things published, that very often officials tend to fret more about contemporary political implications rather than the technical content presentations. And behold, when it comes out that these concerns were totally misplaced. I mean, I can think of these two things in my books and articles that were an issue for the reviewers. It's politics rather than deep technical stuff. So I can very much relate to that story about people fretting about how the French might react to the book. Might prejudice ongoing attitudes or ability to get into the common market, etc. So that rings certainly very true. And it's one of the recurring themes, I fear. I have to go in a few minutes, so I'm very sorry I can't stay around for any follow-up to this. But again, I just want to thank Matthew and Sue very much.
It's great that you're there, John. It's really helpful. So you've provided more insight into the nature of the testing in Australia, but also you've said something which resonates with all of us, that when we publish stuff, the officials are far more anxious about reactions than they need to be, and things are published and hardly anybody ever notices in our experience. Unfortunately, that's often the case. Would anybody else like to chip in at this point in the discussion? It's wide open. If not, I'm gonna go back to Fiona. I can see you've just put your hand up.
Hello, I'm unmuting myself. Yeah, I'm Fiona Bowler. I'm currently writing a book to be published with Liverpool University Press on the history of the British nuclear test veteran movement in the UK. I had a question for Matthew and Sue, actually. Something that kind of hasn't really been spoken about today is the position of Gowing and Arnold as kind of women in these very kind of masculine worlds. I think in Arnold's autobiography, I think Brian Cathcart writes in the foreword, and he writes something like, her book reveals the past as it was experienced by a woman who was almost always the only woman in the room. And I wondered if Matthew or Sue had kind of come across anything that sort of spoke about how what that experience was like for Lorna Arnold and for Margaret Gowing, and how that kind of impacted them, particularly in kind of, I know Arnold did lots of kind of interviews with scientists, whether that was something that kind of she felt was a benefit to her or kind of a disadvantage. And then Sue, I wondered, I know that Lorna Arnold did conduct lots of interviews with scientists, but in her autobiography, again, she says that it would have been too lengthy a task to try and talk to kind of nuclear test veterans. And she also kind of calls their memories fallible, and suggests that there's kind of lots of errors within those. I wondered if you had any kind of comments on that as well.
Thanks. That's some really two extremely important questions. What I might do is ask Matthew to comment first, and then Sue would really be answering both questions, if that's okay. So Matthew, Margaret Gowing's experience.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Great question on Gowing and Arnold as well. But I mean, I was fascinated by this issue of Gowing's, position as a woman in a completely male-dominated world that she was, operating in the 1950s and 60s. And I was trying to, I mean, there's a longer paper that obviously I couldn't talk about in 20 minutes, but I do talk about her prehistory and where she came from. She came from a very working class background as well, from genuine poverty. She was born in North Kensington, and she became, she was committed socialist throughout her life. And she's an interesting figure, I think, to follow because of her background and the way she managed to sort of rise up in this male-dominated world. And in the files, you can see the kind of like unease. There's a kind of unease about, who is this woman? What's she doing in this kind of environment? And can we really rely on her to do this kind of work? And I try to, I want to write a longer version of the paper I gave, and there's some sort of very kind of, veiled kind of misogyny coming through in some of these comments, like the one I said in the paper was, which she might find is a little bit overpowering, very kind of condescending attitude towards her that comes through. But she herself was an incredibly strong personality. You get that impression. I mean, I never encountered her, but from the biographical memoirs and so on, she's a very strong personality. She managed to kind of force her way through into these corridors and getting really, certainly. And also, I think, what I was impressed by was that, you need a sponsor, you need someone to back you. And throughout this time, Makins was very, very supportive of her role, the Atomic Energy Authority, the chairman of the authority. And he would back her in the job that she was trying to do to write this history. So I think that was something I wanted to bring out. But I think, one of the things was frustrating about the pandemic was that the private papers for Margaret Gowing's own private papers were closed for a long time because none of the archives in Oxford were open. They're a History of Science library. One of the things I want to do for this future work going forward is to look at those private papers to see her own, more private reflections on her role. So it kind of opens up that story a bit more about her role as a woman in this male-dominated area of Whitehall. I've got some responses to the other questions that Mike raised, if you want me to go through them now, or should I wait that?
Let's hold on.
Yeah, hold on to that.
I'm using my privilege to ask a supplementary question, and that is, what about her background as a co-author of one of the civil series, the Second World War series, her work with Sir Keith Hancock, because he must have had, I think he had a lot of respect for her. Did he help to promote her career as well?
Yes, I think he did. I mean, when her appointment was first mooted in 58, 59, I think he was a backer of her, and I think vaguely remember from the files seeing some sort of character references he wrote and some references for her. I haven't gone into the and it's another job. I haven't gone into the kind of the histories of the wartime civil histories, you know, when she was working under Hancock, to look at her records there. But they will be there at the National Archives in the Cabinet Office files. There's some pretty extensive files on the background to writing of official histories, which exist, you know, at the National Archives, which are very, you know, they're almost like a social history as well of the way you know, Whitehall operated at that time, because you can see the kind of communications between different you know, different people within the world of, you know, what Pete Hennessy probably would have called the great and the good. I think that was one of his favorite phrases. But you can see you know, with the Gowing history, there's some really interesting correspondence about a selection of the historians that would be her, the 3 historians that would be a kind of oversight committee. And the
Can you tell us who they were?
One of them was going to be, I can't remember offhand, one of them was going to be Charles Webster.
Oh, yeah.
A long time of the LSE as well. I think he ducked out of it. Actually, no, I think he died, actually.
Yes, he died, yeah.
He died, yeah, about that time. And a couple of as well. But, you know, it's just, there's a kind of clearly an old boys network that operates, you know, when it comes to these kinds of selections at this time, which is kind of interesting to read about as well. But
yeah, I mean, of course,
sorry, go on. Yeah.
I'm chipping in again because Charles Webster worked, of course, with Noble Franklin on the history of the strategic bombing offensive, and in a way gave respectability to Franklin to get that very controversial history through.
He did. I mean, even though Franklin, I mean, you know, if you read Franklin's memoir, Franklin did virtually all the work for it. You know, I don't think Webster did much work for it, but he gives because Franklin didn't have this kind of academic background, really. I mean, I think he was working on a PhD, maybe it was a master's thesis he had, but he didn't have a PhD. He didn't have an academic position. Of course, he had a distinguished war record. He'd been a navigator on several missions, I think 20 odd missions in Lancaster's. So it gave him credibility as a historian, as somebody as a participant in the bomber offensive. But it's Franklin who, you know, is the principal author of those books, and Webster gives it the imprint, which means that, you know, it's kind of like gives it the kind of like credibility in the wider world of officialdom, I guess.
We're getting sidetracked. I must come back. So the two questions still stand. One is Arnold's relationship, you know, position as a woman, and the other is the very interesting one about why don't you talk to veterans? So would you please address those two?
Sorry, am I speaking?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Oh, good. Could I just say that on the question of thermonuclear, in that second volume that I put up on the screen, I repeat the correspondence and the statements about how the British were going thermonuclear in Australia. So if people could bear to download that and scan it, you might find that there is an Australian history to the thermonuclear move before grapple. The question of Arnold's relationship with the scientific community, could I put it like that, who were predominantly male, her book, which is called, you know, that one that I forgot, My Short Century, it shows how very embedded she was in the male community of the AEA, and how she respected the people and worked with the people and who were predominantly men. I think that she was embedded in the AEA, and that she was very committed to the project that they were undertaking. And she cites many situations in that book of friendship and intellectual collaboration with the people that she was studying. So I don't think it was quite like some of the people who are here tonight, where the official historians and the writers of the narrative are distanced from the organization. Is that fair enough to say? That they're, you know, I mean, it's almost presented as a desirable, perhaps even a necessity, to be not part of the organization, but both Gowing and Arnold were employees of the organization. And she makes it very clear in her 2012 book, written in her 90s, how much she valued those friendships and intellectual correspondences. Fiona's question, what was that again? Sorry, about.
It was about why didn't Arnold interview veterans of the tests?
I can't answer for Arnold, but let's see. There was an Official Secrets Act in situ through most of the years that she was writing, and the nuclear test veterans really only came out from under the umbrella of that in the 90s, as I remember it, when they began to speak out more specifically about their experiences, and their organizations were formed, and they just didn't have an entree, I think, at that stage into officialdom and into official history writing, or to the AEA or the Ministry of Defence. And I think that has come about more gradually in recent years. But you have to look at it through a time span where it was very brave to speak out about these matters, and it wasn't easy for the veterans to make their voice heard. And that's really the story of what has happened since 1992, that voice has grown. And, you know, I think Fiona's work is probably going to be another example of it having been heard and finding a form of expression. But there's a concept of subaltern history, and I'm afraid they were the subalterns.
Yeah.
And they didn't get a voice at the negotiating table.
Fiona, do you want to come back on that one? Because I got the impression from what you said that it was that Arnold actually chose not to interview them. Is that your reading of it?
Yeah. Yeah, so interestingly, yeah, so the BNTVA, the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association, which I know Sue's had a lot of kind of communication with, particularly in the 80s and 90s, they actively encouraged members of the community to go and give evidence at the Royal Commission in 85, which many veterans did. But yeah, Arnold, I think, chose not to interview veterans because of their kind of views that their health had been affected by the tests. But I think definitely as well, I think as Sue said, it is very much they've struggled to have their voices heard, and I think that is very much something that comes through. And I think that example of Arnold neglecting to interview them or neglecting to include their voices within the official history, when, you know, these men now are some of the last surviving men who have witnessed nuclear weapons being detonated, and they're now kind of in their 80s and 90s, and I think that's very interesting. It points to something very interesting about the position of official history and the position of observers, and if we can call them victims of those official histories, being excluded from that narrative. And so, you know, hopefully, as Sue said very kindly, hopefully my work will kind of reintroduce them into that history. But I think it is very, very interesting, that decision that was made by Arnold and by other historians as well. But thank you, Sue. And you know, I've written about Sue for many years now.
That's good.
Interestingly, and her kind of involvement in the community. So it's really lovely to speak to you and to hear you talk about it.
It's great to have you both on the call. I'm now looking at the comments, and I see Gary Willis has an interesting question. I don't know whether you'd like to just read it out, Gary, because I think it links back to what Mike Goodman's questions to Matthew. It's a similar sort of question, but would you just like to repeat it, please?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much. Basically, it was given that historians now are able to look at least some of the material that that Margaret Gowing used for her official history, do we feel that she did a good objective job, or was she prone to some self-censorship over certain issues which she felt were best left out, which to the average objective historian should have been included? Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And that sort of links to Mike's third question, which was basically what was omitted. So Matthew, can you answer those questions?
Well, I mean, the British nuclear story in the Second World War is a huge one, of course. And what Gowing does, I think, which is so commendable, is that she reduces this in a way, she synthesizes it into a very readable, compact volume, you know, and as I think Mike said in his comments as well, it's a very readable book. You know, it's one of the best official histories in terms of, you know, how you can pick it up. It's a great story. But she does, I mean, she does leave. I mean, she doesn't take a fully kind of, you could say, she doesn't take a fully international dimension. So she confined herself to UK records, didn't look at US records, she didn't look at other states. She doesn't talk about the German nuclear program, you know, to the concerns on the intelligence side about the progress of the German nuclear program, for example. And, you know, I guess it comes into the second volume, which was in 2 parts, that was published in 1974 more, but there's the whole espionage story, of course, the Fuchs being a member of the British mission and Manhattan Project and so on and so forth. I mean, she doesn't kind of give much away in terms of that fuller story. Now, I don't know if that's a case of her censoring herself or really her saying, well, basically, I want to produce a history, you know, from essentially Atomic Energy Authority records, Cabinet Office records. And she doesn't go into the depth into say War Office kind of files and areas like that. But you know, I think she had set herself the brief of writing this compact, accessible, authoritative history that would have this wider readership. But also would I think fulfill this brief, which, and I think it does do this, you know. And one of I think Mike's first question was, you know, what's the value of the history? What it does do is it does tell the British story, and up to that point, there hadn't been something which had been widely talked about and acknowledged, and that was obviously one of the avowed, you know, reasons for why the AEC and others and Trend and so on thought that a UK side to the story was necessary, because, you know, in a sense, this had gone by default. You know, people had not recognised Britain's kind of role and so on as a nuclear pioneer, you know, the work of the Maud Committee and so on. And we know these things now, and we talk about them very often. But I think Gowing's work really puts them much more centre stage. You know, Gowing's work did that. And I think that's the, you know, so in terms of Mike's question, what's the lasting value of the work? I think it does show that this was you know, at its outset anyway, the nuclear program was a British enterprise initially, and then became an, you know, eventually an Anglo-American one. Was, you know, also there was a separate, obviously, strand of work that started in the United States, and then it kind of merged into an Anglo-American one, where the Americans were clearly the vastly senior partner, but the British role was still not to be kind of completely ignored. You know, and I think at one point, Gowing, in one of her shorter articles, she's asked, you know, so what was the British contribution to the Manhattan Project? You know, did it make a difference? And her conclusion was, yes, it did make a difference. It probably probably maybe shortened the path to a usable or deliverable weapon by about, she reckons, about 3 to 6 months. So, you know, that's, you know, those kinds of judgments are kind of useful for the historian to kind of reflect on those, you know, whether you do agree or disagree with that, from her knowledge of the records. And of course, because she had set herself the task of writing this kind of a history within a short time scale, there's no way she could have embarked upon a comprehensive history looking at this vast array of records. So in a way, you kind of like, you know, it's about what the remit is. It's about what the kind of aim of the historian is when they go about writing these histories. I mean, as Mike said, the Hinsley histories, the intelligence histories, they're comprehensive histories. They're designed to kind of go through the history of British intelligence, particularly signals intelligence, and show the contribution of Enigma to victory. And they do that in a very meticulous way. That's a very different kind of, you know, they're a different kind of approach to the one that Gowing chose to take, I think, very, very successfully chose to take in the early 60s. So I don't know if that's much of an answer, but that's my thoughts.
I think
on
that's a very helpful answer. And I think, somebody's already commented on the Hinsley history, which runs to 5 volumes and is definitely not readable. I mean, you can dip into it and get stuff out of it, but it's not a book you'd read for pleasure. There was a slight sub question that Mike had as well, and that was her book as frank as the American history? Did she actually look at presumably she must have looked at what the Americans had written before or as she was writing? Would that be the case?
Yes, I think she must. I mean, I don't know the answer to that question, because I don't think I can remember anything that she was writing where she then reflected on her own impressions of the American history. But what is interesting, though, is that Leslie Groves writes to her after the publication of the book, and he's full of praise. He actually says, "You have got it. You have really, really got this account very, very accurately. You've portrayed it, just as I remember it." And in fact, he's full of, and it's actually instigates really surprising, of course, if you know about Groves, what kind of a character he was. And Gowing actually thought that Groves came across quite well in the Oppenheimer hearings. And if you've seen the Oppenheimer film, you probably remember the character of Groves in that film and the way he testifies at the Oppenheimer hearings in 1954. But Gowing kind of, I think, respected Groves because he doesn't kind of denounce Oppenheimer. I mean, he doesn't actually defend him either, but in a sense, you'd expect him to be kind of the hardline anti-communist denunciation of Oppenheimer, but he doesn't do that. He actually says, no, I thought he was loyal and so on, when he worked on the Manhattan Project. So, I mean, Gowing at least thought Oppenheimer came out better after those hearings than a lot of other people, of course, like Teller. But it starts, the publication of the book in 1964 then starts his very warm correspondence between Gowing and Groves, which goes on all the way till Groves's death in 1979. Groves died in 1979, but there's this kind of warm correspondence between the two of them, which is really surprising from this kind of left-wing socialist woman historian and this diehard anti-communist, tough as nails American Army retired American Army officer. But there's this kind of like correspondence between the two, which I found was very interesting to look at as well. So again, that's my thoughts on that question.
Thanks very much. That's again, there's so much new stuff keeps coming out. It's a really interesting final point. Fiona has just put a note in the chat as well. The person who replaced Webster when he died was G.C. Adams, a name I don't recognize actually, but obviously people who know the field do. But thanks for that. Would anybody else like to make any contributions or comments before we move on? Because if not, I might just ask our contributors just if they have any final comments or reflections. Maybe Sue, anything you'd like to say in conclusion?
Thank you. Well, where to start in a way, but I think that there are 10,000 pages at least of evidence given to the Royal Commission in Australia and in London, which really haven't been read, that are available online. That's just from the people who testified to the Royal Commission. And there is a huge number of items in the archival files of the UK National Archives and the Australian, which have never been opened and looked at by the public or historians. And there's a huge body of work that needs to be done because there's so much more in there than a few official institutions have told us, with a bit of carping on the sidelines from independents like me. But there's a huge body of, I would say, something like 40, 50,000 pages of material, which is sat there in London and then in Australia because of the Royal Commission being in Australia, really unexamined. And you have to wonder how that was achieved.
Is that your final thought? Thanks very much. An agenda then for everybody else. Mike, anything you'd like to add before we finish? No. Okay. Matthew, you probably said what you wanted to say. Yeah, good. Well, that's great. I think we'll probably wrap up now. And thanks very much for everybody who's listened in and contributed. Just a reminder that, that our next session is with Jill Bennett and Declan O'Reilly on the 20th of March, and it's on intelligence history. So goodbye, everybody, and thanks very much for joining us. And thanks especially to our three speakers. Thank you. Bye-bye.